The topic of this section is dishonesty, the ways we lie and cheat, but still think of ourselves as good people. A guy goes into a church and goes into confession, and he says to the priest, "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned." And the father said, "What have you done, my son?" And the guy said, "I'm 72 years old and I just had sex with two 25-year-old twins." And the priest said, "This is terrible. Please say 700 times Hail Mary and walk around the church 7 times and give $1,000 to charity. And how long has it been since your last confession?" And the guy said, "I've never been to confession." And the priest said, "You're 72 years old and you've never been to confession? How can that be?" The guy says, "I'm Jewish." So then the priest said, "So why are you doing here and why are you telling me?" And the guy said, "I'm telling everybody." What is it about dishonesty? When we think about dishonesty, we have a very simple model of dishonesty. We have a model that people do the cost-benefit analysis. What do we stand to gain? What do we stand to lose? Is this worth it? But it turns out that throughout the studies you will see in this section, this is not actually a good model. Instead, lots of other things are driving us to both be honest and be dishonest. And as you will see, a more nuanced and complete understanding of this problem is both going to help us figure out what's going on and also help us figure out how to fight dishonesty. So first of all, try to be honest and ask yourself whether you have cheated in the last year. If you have, raise your hand. What about the last month? What about the last week? What about today? The reality is that you probably realize that we lie and cheat lots of the time. And at the same time, while we do those actions, we don't think of ourselves as being immoral. And that's kind of the dilemma I want to talk about. We often think about crime as a few individuals who steal a lot of money and cheat a lot. But I want us to think about the cheating that we can all do, that we can all be part of, and how does it really work? Okay, so I actually started thinking about dishonesty when Enron kind of collapsed all of a sudden. And my question, the question that puzzled me at the time was, what was the cause for the collapse of Enron? Were there 3 bad apples that planned and plotted and executed this incredible accounting scheme? Is this the best explanation for what's going on? Or is the explanation that there were lots of people at Enron and around Enron that were not active, vicious people, but were turning a blind eye to something really bad that was going on and benefiting them at the same time? Kind of wishful blindness. And I happened to meet John Perry Barlow, who used to write lyrics and manage a group called Grateful Dead. And at some point, John Perry Barlow, who is a wonderful person, became a consultant for Enron. And this, of course, can be thought of as a commentary of the times. But beyond that, when I met John Perry Barlow, he told me that when he was a consultant for Enron, not only was he oblivious to what was going on, he created an ideology for himself that protected him from seeing all the bad things that were happening around. So this was not just wishful blindness, it was active blindness when he was trying to create an ideology to make himself not see all the bad things that he didn't want to see because he was getting paid by Enron. So this question of how do we want to think about dishonesty? Do we want to think about it as the property of a few bad apples? Or do we want to think about it about something that we can all do is actually very important. Because, for example, what should we do about dishonesty as a company? If we think it's only bad apples, then we should improve our HR processes. We should just not hire bad apples. Or if people become bad apples, we should fire them later on. But if everybody is capable of that, that's not that easy. The same thing we can ask about government. What should the government do with bad apples? If it's just a few of them, we can think about how to kick them off. But there's something about the fabric of how the government governs and how people are influenced by each other, then we need to think very differently about these structures. And of course, the same thing happens with individuals cheating. So let's take a step back and let's say, what do we know about cheating and how do we measure it? So let's start with the measurement issue. I do experiments. I try to create something that I can measure a bit more precisely than asking people for their opinions about something or what they would do. And here is the method I came up with. We gave people a sheet of paper with 20 simple math problems. These were math problems that everybody could solve given enough time. You would just have to look for the different cells in the matrix and look for the two numbers that add to 10. There's lots of those combinations, and when you find the two numbers that add to 10, you know that you've found it, but it takes a while to find those. So we give people a sheet of these problems. We give them 20 problems in one sheet, and we say, why don't you go ahead and solve as many of those as you can in the next 5 minutes? And we will pay you, let's say, $1 per question for each one you get correctly. We say to people, please flip the page and get go. Start. People start. They work as fast as they can. At the end of the 5 minutes, we say, stop. Put your pencil down and count how many questions you got correctly. Again, these are questions that are quite self-evident whether you got the right answer or not. People count how many ones they got correctly. And then we say, now, please take the sheet of paper and go to the back of the room. And please shred the sheet of paper. And then come back to the front of the room and tell me how many questions you got correctly, and I will pay you accordingly. People do this, they count, they go to the back, they shred, they come back to the front of the room, and they announce how many questions they got correctly. People on average announce that they solve 6 problems, and they get paid accordingly. What the people in this experiment do not know is that we fixed the shredder, so that the shredder only shred the sides of the page. So when you put the page in, it gives you the satisfaction of the noise of the shredder and the slowness of the progression, but the main part of the page remains intact. And we can jump in later on and find out how many problems people really solve correctly. And what do we find when we do it? We find that people solve 4 problems, but they report to be solving 6. Now you can ask the question of how is this distribution of cheating looks like? Is it that most people are honest, reporting 4 and solving really 4, and a few people are cheating a lot and they're shifting the average? No, it turns out lots and lots of people cheat. In fact, we find very few people that cheat in an egregious way, and instead we find lots and lots of people who cheat just a little bit. Now, you can say, okay, so let's find out why are people cheating and why are people cheating a little bit. So to examine this, let's first think about what is the economic rational theory of cheating. And the economic rational theory of cheating goes back to the famous Chicago economist Gary Becker. And the story goes that Gary Becker one day is driving to the University of Chicago looking for a place to park his car. He can't find a legal parking spot and he's about to be late for a meeting. And Gary Becker does a quick calculation. He said, what is the benefit of getting to the meeting on time? What is the cost of parking illegally? And he compares those things, decides to park illegally, and gets to the meeting on time. And as he walks around the University of Chicago to the meeting, he thinks that what he has done is basically a cost-benefit analysis about a crime, a minor crime, but a crime. He was thinking about the benefit of getting to the meeting on time. He was thinking about the risk of being caught and getting a ticket and the cost of such parking ticket, and he was comparing the two of them. And in comparing the benefit and the cost, he decided whether it's worthwhile for him to park illegally or not. And from that point on, Gary Becker said that all decisions about moral issues and dishonesty are like that. They're about the cost and benefit. So for example, every time you pass by a grocery store or a gas station, you should ask yourself, how much money is in the till? What's the chance they'll catch me if I rob this grocery store and gas station? How much time will I get in prison, minus the time for good behavior? And you should do a cost-benefit analysis and decide whether to hit the gas station or not. Realize that in this conception of this problem, there's no morality. It's just about cost and benefit. So with this understanding about cost and benefit and the rational approach for dishonesty, let's take a step back and let's go back to our method, the little experiment with the matrices, and see, can we test the Becker theory? So the Becker theory has 3 components. How much money you stand to gain, what's the probability you'll get caught, and how much time will you get in prison, or what's the size of the punishment. We started with the first one. How much money do you stand to gain? We gave this sheet to some people and we said, if you solve these problems correctly, for each one you solve, you will get 10 cents. To another group, you said for each problem you will solve, you'll get 25 cents. Another group, we offered 50 cents. Another group, $1, $2, $5. The highest group was promised $10 per correct question. We gave them 5 minutes. They did the task. They shredded a piece of paper. They reported how much cheating did we see and what happened to cheating as a function of how much money they were promised per correct question. Before I tell you the answer for this, we created another experiment in which we just describe to people. In the same way I'm describing to you, we describe to people the experiment. And we say, hey, if this was the experiment, how much do you think people would cheat? At 25 cents, 50 cents, $1, $2, $5, $10. And what people predicted, what they thought would happen, was the cheating would increase as the amount of the reward goes up. In essence, people had the same theory as Becker. The cheating is influenced by the amount of money we stand to gain, and therefore, as the amount of money goes up, so with the level of cheating. But when we did the experiment for real, what did we find? We find lots of people cheating just by a little bit, and this amount of cheating was independent on the amount of money that they got. In fact, for $10 per correct question, cheating was slightly lower than for all other amounts. So first of all, it doesn't go up, and if anything, it goes down. That was the first part of the Becker element. What about the next one? What about the probability of being caught? We played with that as well. Some people, we asked them to tear half the sheet and only shred half the sheet and submit to us the other half. So we would have some evidence of what they did, and some evidence were eliminated. Other people we asked to eliminate and shred the whole sheet of paper. Another group we asked to shred the piece of paper, leave the room, and pay themselves for a ball of money that had over $100 in it. Now, if you think about it, shredding half a piece, half the page has some probability of being caught. Shredding the whole page has less probability of being caught. Shredding the whole page and leaving and paying yourself for a ball of money had even lower probability of being caught. What happened? Again, before I tell you the real result, we asked people to predict. What do you think would happen? And people predicted that as the probability of being caught would go down, the amount of cheating would go up. Again, suggesting that people's naive theories about what's driving dishonesty is very much in line with the Becker theory. But what did we find when we did the experiment for real? We found that lots of people cheated just by a little bit and independent of the probability of being caught. Now, you might say something else. You might say, maybe what's going on here is that people think they can cheat a little bit and not being caught. If you say, if I really solve 4 and I only report 6, nobody will be suspicious. But if I report 7, all of a sudden people would become suspicious in that. So we tried that as well. We told some people, we say, hey, the average person in this experiment solves 4 problems. We told another group that the average person in this experiment solves 8 problems. Now, if people just don't want to be detected, when they're told other people have solved 4, maybe they would claim 6. And when they were told that other people would solve 8, they could report 10. But what happened? No difference between those two conditions. In both of them, people really solved 4 and reported 6. So again, it doesn't look like it's about the probability of being caught or about wanting to go about some threshold, and not even about the reward. So what is going on here? You could say, well, people don't care about the rewards and punishment, how much they stand to gain, probability of being caught. People just are moral, wonderful creatures. Maybe in Freudian terms, it would be the superego. We have this notion of society about what is appropriate and inappropriate, and we've internalized that, and that's basically what's ruling our behavior. We're kind of angels. But we can't say that as well, because we see lots of people are cheating. Just a little bit, but lots of people are cheating. So we have this tension that people are dishonest, but at the same time people don't react to the economic incentives. So what we need is a new model of what causes people to be dishonest that is not relying solely on the economic incentive of the amount of money to be gained, probability of being caught, and time in prison.